Good afternoon, and welcome to Season 5 of Itasca Water's Practical Water Wisdom series, which focuses on issues related to water and ways to resolve those issues. I'm your host, John Downing. Today's episode is called Waterbird Biology, Ecology, and Conservation. Itasca Waters is a nonprofit volunteer organization headquartered in the Itasca Headwaters region of Minnesota, for the purpose of educating folks about the value of clean water for the environment and the economy. Itasca Waters has provided 15 years of protecting and promoting clean water in the region, brought in $3 million in grants and contributions, all of which went for water science and education. We've also educated thousands of students and community members, strengthened local conservation capacity, and we've been recognized as a key nonprofit for lake and watershed stewardship. Although we are located in the headwaters of the Mississippi River, the Great Lakes, and Hudson Bay, you don't need to live near us to join us. Please consider becoming a member of Itasca Waters by using the QR code on your screen or going to itascawaters.org/donate and using the guest login. Membership is quick, secure, deductible, and is only $30. Now, we thank these partners who have been with us all along, helping Itasca Waters offer our Water Wisdom series. Annie Bracey will speak to us for about a half hour and then take your questions. To submit a brief question, just click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and type it in. You can do that at any time during today's program, and we will read the questions on your behalf. Today's program is being recorded and will soon be available on our website, itascawaters.org. As mentioned, today's webinar focuses on waterbird biology, ecology, and conservation. We're pleased to welcome our presenter, Annie Bracey. Annie is an avian ecologist with over 15 years of experience at the University of Minnesota's Natural Resources Research Institute. Her work focuses on monitoring and managing wetland and waterbird populations across Minnesota and the Great Lakes, using movement data and recapture methods to better understand risks and population dynamics. She holds a Ph.D. in conservation biology from the University of Minnesota with research on inland breeding common terns, and is broadly interested in how human activities influence bird populations and inform conservation decisions. So let's get to it. Here is Annie Bracey. Over to you, Annie.
Yes, my name's Annie Bracey, and I'm really thankful for the invite to be here today to talk about some of the research that we do at the Natural Resources Research Institute, specifically focusing on waterbirds, even though we study all sorts of different birds. It's the focus of the talk today and the group of species that I am most passionate about working with. So in the time that we have together today, I just want to kind of describe to you what waterbirds are, how we monitor them and research them, what their value is, and hopefully provide you with some evidence that they are really enjoyable to have around. They can be sometimes considered nuisance, some of the species. So I'm just going to describe all of the great things about them today. And we'll look forward to any questions that you have. I'll briefly share some results that we have from the data we've been collecting, but I really just wanted to focus on how we study them and why they're important. So as I mentioned, I work in the Avian Ecology Lab at the Natural Resources Research Institute, which is part of the University of Minnesota. It's an applied research institute. So all of the work that we do is in an effort to provide management and on-the-ground solutions to biodiversity loss, species that are in need of conservation. And to do that with a team, we work really hard together. We have a lot of fun together. So I forgot to mention, we have 7 full-time staff, and then currently we have 3 graduate students and 2 undergraduate students that are working in the lab. And Most of the data that we collect, of course, as you can imagine, happens during a very short period of time, which is typically at the end of May to early July each year. So during that time, we are out in the field almost daily trying to collect really critical information on breeding birds in the state. So as you know, likely that biodiversity loss is happening rapidly and on a global scale. And so it's really critical that we get a handle on what the causes of biodiversity loss and when and where possible to mitigate those losses is one of the focuses of our research at NRI. More specifically, we know that, birds are one of the most well-studied taxa globally. And from having a really long-term, consistent data set, people have been really able to document significant declines in bird populations throughout the last 5 decades. And so basically, this is across fields of species, so be it grassland birds, boreal forest birds, we are seeing really sharp declines in species. And so, of course, we're trying to figure out where and why that's happening. In North America, if we look at this from a habitat perspective, we can see that birds are declining again in almost all habitat types except for wetlands. Wetlands are the only places where we've seen gains in populations, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But basically, this is a signal that, we really need to understand what's happening at these different scales and throughout these different habitats. One of the major reasons for decline, as you can imagine, it's a very complicated and complex thing with multiple things happening, but habitat loss is really very significant for all taxa, including birds. And we can see that again in the image on the right-hand side. That's kind of breaking it down by types of birds. We see that most birds are declining, and waterfowl are the only birds that have seen any gains in populations. And again, with the wetlands and the waterfowl, you can imagine that those things are associated, and they are really strongly tied to the efforts of hunters and organizations to really understanding that these waterfowl populations are really tied to these habitats. So there was a lot of money put into protecting and restoring wetlands, and that's a really good sign because we can see that, in fact, it's effective and we're able to see that there are some gains for those species. In Minnesota, we know there has been, significant land use changes over the last 100 years, and primarily that's driven by shifts in agriculture. So cropland increases, of course, then correspond to declines in prairie habitat. And so we know that a lot has happened to change the landscape of Minnesota by humans. We also know that Minnesota is a really, really important place for breeding birds in North America. We have some of the highest bird diversity in North America, and people come here from all over to find species that they are interested. So we have a very wonderful state for bird watching, and many of you probably already know that. So just to think about waterbirds specifically, so this is a question that comes up a lot, and it makes sense. So when we talk about waterbirds, what exactly does that mean? What is a waterbird? And the reason it's complicated is because it's not necessarily tied directly to a species' genetics or evolution. It has more to do with a shared ecological use of water. So this schematic is kind of describing that is that different species of birds that are fall into the group of waterbirds are just birds that use water, live in or around water for a significant proportion of their life. And as you can imagine, species do this in different ways. So seabirds typically are referring to, as you can imagine, individuals that live in marine environments for most of their life. And you can further split that out to species that are coastal or pelagic using open water versus nearshore systems, and then shorebirds found on our shorelines or wetlands and coastal systems, and then waterfowl, again, which depend on water for feeding and breeding and throughout the year. So within this group of water birds, you do have different species that are ecologically distinct, and you can see that, like imagine a shorebird with long legs, they are have very different physical characteristics and are not necessarily directly related. Some of the waterbird ecosystem services, so people wonder, how are waterbirds beneficial? We know that in general, any kind of diversity promotes a healthy ecosystem, right? So the more diverse birds you have using a space, the more potential there is for these ecosystem services. So that could be anything from transporting nutrients, seed dispersal, ecosystem engineering. Basically, they can change the habitats that they live in when they're breeding, even just physically by their presence. Pest and weed control, we use them oftentimes as bioindicators of pollution or disease surveillance, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. They're also used in by many people as actual food resources. So obviously keeping the populations can be really important to different cultures for different reasons. And having raw materials like feathers, which obviously we use in guano harvesting. And then the cultural services they provide are recreation and tourism, spiritual and aesthetic value, and then education and research. So this is just a really broad generalization of some of the ways in which waterbirds provide beneficial things to humans. So again, reasons to study waterbirds, they can tell you a lot about water quality and toxins. They can be used as climate change signals, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Waterbirds, there are some characteristics about them that make them really useful to study. And one of those is that they have really high nest and site fidelity. So basically, if an adult breeding bird is nesting at a location, if it survives the next year, it is very likely to return to the same location to try to breed the next year. These species are also very long-lived relative to a lot of other bird species. For example, some of the common terns can live into their late 20s. The oldest bird that we captured was 29 years old. And so with that, we have the ability to repeatedly capture the same individuals over time, which is another really good way to monitor birds at a really fine level to look at populations and connectivity. They also have a really broad global distribution, and so it really connects us to the world. Other people are studying these animals. We can really learn a lot about them. Because these birds are migratory, of course, then there are things that can impact their health, fitness, and survival when they're not at the breeding grounds in Minnesota. And so disease outbreaks and exposure to contaminants, these are just actually a short list of things that can potentially impact these birds throughout the year. But it's just kind of a reminder that, oftentimes if birds are declining, people will say, well, how do we know that what's impacting them is happening here, or is it happening during the wintering grounds? And we really do have the tools to answer those questions. And so it's not really a good reason to not understand what's happening in a system to think that the problem is happening elsewhere. So we have all the tools we need to answer those questions. And that is what we try to do in our lab. And I just wanted to put some pictures of waterbirds that are commonly found in Minnesota, which many of you are probably quite familiar with. People in Duluth really look forward to the pelican migration that will be happening this month. We've got pelicans, cormorants, egrets, great blue heron, gulls, and terns. And so we've got ring-billed gull and common tern down here. These species can breed in many different locations. So oftentimes you'll see cormorants and herons and egrets nesting in trees, whereas other species like pelicans will nest more like on island habitats in bigger areas. And then gulls and terns, they can nest in marshes or on shoreline habitat. So it's quite variable where they nest, but one of the commonalities is that these species are colonial nesting. And so that means they nest in dense, high density. So you don't have one nest here and one nest 20 kilometers away. They nest really close together. And so that's another reason that they're good for monitoring, is that they're very conspicuous. Another question that comes up a lot is, what's the difference between a gull and a tern? And they are part of the same family, so they, of course, do have some shared features, but they are functionally very different how they interact with their environment. So the ring-billed gull, for example, is a generalist. It's much bulkier. It will eat pretty much anything, whereas a tern is primarily terns forage on fish. And so even the wing shape and how they fly and their agility is very different. So, and they are typically smaller than gulls as well as ring-billed gulls, and of course herring gulls, which are quite a bit bigger than ring-billed gulls. Some of the ways that we study waterbirds in the lab, again, a lot of it is from aerial imagery, because a lot of these birds do nest in remote locations. So we have a drone that we'll use if we're able to get close enough to the colony to fly there with enough battery span. And we can get these aerial images that are really high resolution. And then in the lab, we can zoom in and actually count individual birds of different species. Another way that we do that is through airplane flights. So Steve Colby, one of my coworkers, he is one that typically does the colonial surveys with the DNR, and he takes his camera up there and will take lots of images of each of the colonies and then later stitch them together and count birds. So here's an example of what one of those images might look like. You can imagine that counting birds from an airplane is impossible, which is true. And so it's later when you get the images back that you can kind of zoom in and look at them. But even with that, you can see in this example, rocks, you can see a lot of double-crested cormorants. There's also some gulls in there. But you can see that the features of this habitat make it more challenging to get an accurate count of birds than this instance, where it's very open. There's not a lot of visual obstruction at the site, and you can see that when we later go in to digitize those locations, that it's relatively easy to get a pretty accurate count of species nesting. So for the tern species that are in Minnesota, there are common terns, black terns, Forster's terns, and Caspian terns. Our lab has studied the first three in some detail, and Caspian terns are nesting on Leech Lake, but not really anywhere else that we know of in the state. So they're a little bit harder to study just because their nesting population is low in the state. So I just wanted to show you some images of eBird maps, which is a citizen science-based program. Maybe a lot of you contribute. Basically, anyone can contribute sightings of birds anytime you are anywhere in the world. And this can really provide a very nice real-time information about how birds are moving across the globe. And again, it's just highlighting these three species which we study, and I'll talk a little bit about. But seeing that, common terns have again a broad global distribution. They're really well studied in Europe as well. Black terns, we can see that we have a lot of information on their movements as well. And then Forster's terns, it's one of the only tern species that is pretty much confined to North America, and it's the least well-studied tern. So we took up studying them last year as well. So some of the methods that we use to study water birds are putting on tracking devices. So again, just understanding that without really knowing how these birds are moving and where, it's a lot more challenging to assess risk. So we use these different technologies, depending on the size of the bird and what they can carry, to try to inform how they're moving, where they're eating, what their connectivity is. So are they connected throughout the entire year, or do they separate and come back together? And so we've used solar geolocators, which basically collect light and then give you estimates of latitude and longitude. So you can imagine with that, we're really just looking at large scale migration routes and wintering distribution, because there's a relatively large amount of error around that. As things have gotten better technologically, we can now use global positioning system transmitters, which have about a 10-meter resolution error, so we can get much more fine scale information about how these birds are moving and how they're connected. And then with radio telemetry, we use the MODIS station, which basically are radio telemetry stations throughout the world, but they're very heavily concentrated in North America, to look at species that we can't track with these bigger units, or young birds that may not come back. So here's just some information that we got from putting these different tracking devices on common terns. So we did this in collaboration with the Canadian Wildlife Service and some other researchers at Cornell. And we were able to track almost 100 birds and identify what their stopover locations are, where they were wintering. And what we found was that over 70% of the birds that we tracked were all wintering in coastal Peru. And so that's really valuable information to know that we can really pinpoint where the population is during the winter. We also identified Lake Erie as being an incredibly important stopover location, with birds staying there from anywhere from a week to up to 3 months prior to migrating. So this is helpful for conservation in that, again, we can identify hot spots where these birds are consistently reliant on a location. We were also able to use the GPS data to look at how the birds were migrating in terms of their behavior. So were the males and females from these colonies migrating together, or did they separate and then come back together? And what we found was that these birds were very highly connected. And so even if they weren't moving exactly at the same time and place, they were meeting up in the same locations, which again is useful information for understanding how to help prioritize conservation. We did something similarly for black terns. Again, we could really look at the length of stay that these birds had, where they were moving, and we found that Panama was one of the places that almost all of the birds that we tracked went. We collected blood to also look at their population genetic structure across the breeding range, and this is a species that has had significant declines across North America, and so really being able to fill in this information has been very helpful for making plans for conservation. And here are some pictures from Forster's terns, which we put transmitters on last summer at Cotton Lake near the Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge. We went out there and put some solar GPS trackers on Forster's terns. And so again, as the technology has gotten better, we've been able to do more. And with these birds, this is the first time we've been able to track them and actually collect their data in real time. For the other studies, we had to get the transmitter back from the bird the year after. And so having this real-time data has been amazing. So basically every day I get an email showing me where each of these birds is, and we had collected data every 30 minutes during daylight hours. So we have, again, really high resolution information about how these birds are using the habitat, where they're wintering. And this is, again, a collaborative project with partners throughout North America. And so it's really important whenever we can to try to put whatever we're studying into a larger context to be able to ask some of these questions. So we almost always try to collaborate with others. And so here's just a screenshot of what I get every day. It basically shows what the battery life is, where the bird was last seen, and if the battery starts getting really low, I can change how often we get fixes, and then the next time it connects with a cell tower, it will implement that new schedule. So there's a lot of flexibility in these new transmitters. Other ways that we study birds on the breeding season, we take blood samples, we collect feathers, we collect feces, we collect regurgitated fish. So we can look at, one of the things we've looked at a lot with this species is exposure to mercury. But we can, look at diet composition. And then we also ban the birds. So every year we banned all of the chicks that are hatched at each of the common tern colonies. And then over time with this long-term data set, we can start answering questions about survival and identifying where the population is being impacted. So again, in collaboration with Wisconsin and Minnesota DNR, we've used over 40 years of nest monitoring and mark-recapture data to look at what's happening with the population. One of the interesting things that we found was that a relatively large proportion of the population are non-breeding adults. And so one of the thoughts is that suggests there's a lack of available nesting habitat for these birds to breed. Other things we can identify is when there are significant predation events or a storm that completely wipe out a site, we can get a sense of how much those events are actually impacting the population over time. With the tracking devices and the mercury exposure, again, we were able to track where these birds are foraging. And then by looking at their blood and feather samples, we could see what their mercury concentrations were. And what we found for the site in the St. Louis River estuary right here in the Duluth Harbor was that adults that fed their chicks a diet that were more from the St. Louis River had higher concentrations of mercury. Which isn't necessarily unexpected, but we were really able to quantify that, how significant where a bird forages can impact potentially the health of their chicks. So this is a study that's ongoing, and we're also using these mercury as pre and post restoration and remediation data. So the thought is that if the remediation efforts were effective in the St. Louis River and it reduced some of the legacy contribution of mercury in the system, that we should be able to see this through continual sampling of feathers, is that the mercury will be reduced and also the source of the mercury will not be suggestive that it's coming from industrial sources. And then I just wanted to focus on another basic way that we can study these populations, especially for terns, which are harder to survey by aerial imagery, as I was talking about before, for some of the bigger species like pelicans and cormorants. We pretty much have to get out on the ground and study these birds. So basically, with an LCCMR funded project in 2022 and 2023, we looked at historical records from the Minnesota DNR and other sources to identify locations across Minnesota where both black terns and Forster's terns had previously been nesting. And basically, our aim was just to go back out and inventory these sites to see if these birds were still present and estimate their abundance. And then while we were there, we were also interested in collecting information about food availability, some habitat features to see if we could really understand how these populations were changing. So we put out aerial insect traps, which basically will collect emergent insects. So this is for black terns, which eat more insects and some fish. And then we collected fish for the Forster's terns. We also put out cameras, which we could use to document predation events on nests or nesting success. In this case, I decided to share really happy ones, which show that these birds, these black terns, both successfully fledged young this year. And so that's just another way that we can measure productivity and try to look for impacts of either flooding or predation on these populations. And then I was just going to share a few images that some of the people in our lab are really great at taking photos. And obviously, these birds are spectacular to watch, forage, and if you have the opportunity and you have any of these species on the lakes where you live, you're lucky. And here's just an image of some Forster's terns, and then again, us trying to assess food availability. And this is actually another good reason to put tracking devices on, because if you're using food availability as kind of an index for whether these birds can be supported at a lake, but then you put a tracking device on them and see that they forage, 25 kilometers away, collecting this local scale information doesn't link up with how these birds are actually using their space. So these things can be complementary, but it's really critical to understand the movement of these birds. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on here was just that, collecting all this long-term monitoring data is really, really critical to answering questions about ecosystem health, about how these populations are doing. And so one of the things that we did, again, with an LCCMR funded project, was created this database of common tern data, primarily for managers to use to really understand the dynamics of these colonies and how they're shifting over time. So common terns are currently listed in the state as a threatened species. They've really only been nesting in 4 locations across the state: in Lake of the Woods, here in the Duluth Superior Harbor, at Leech Lake, and then Mille Lacs Lake. And in both Mille Lacs and Leech Lake, unfortunately, the productivity has been very poor, or the terns just aren't nesting on Mille Lacs right now. So these numbers are continuing to decline. So if we have data that's in a format that's ready to be used, that is standardized, we can really ask these questions more quickly. And so data management is a huge component to anything that's successful. And then collaboration, of course, is also key. So understanding what's happening in your lake or in your backyard is really critical. And there are a lot of things that you can do to make it a better place, which I'll talk about next. But also collaborating and trying to understand things at scale is really important when you have species that, utilize the entire globe during the year. So some of the ways that you can help protect waterbirds, obviously just being responsible in terms of controlling your pets. So keeping dogs on leashes, keeping cats in houses, are really critical. Switching to lead-free tackle, cleaning up fishing line, especially with colonial nesting waterbirds. Every year, there hasn't been a year that we haven't gone out and removed lines from birds, either before or after they had died. But it's a really serious issue. If you're a boater, being mindful of your speed, of course, as a lot of these birds nest. If you see a black tern nest, it's almost unbelievable that they're ever successful. They're just floating on these very small reeds. So obviously water from wakes can really impact these birds significantly. Other ways, even though this isn't waterbird related, but keeping your bird feeders clean, using bird-friendly window coverings. And then more specifically, if you're lucky and you live on a lake or you have a lake home, things that you can do that are incredibly helpful are maintaining a buffer so you're not mowing all the way down to the lake. You have a buffer of vegetation, native vegetation, reducing your use of chemicals on lawns, and then helping to keep storm drains clean and clear. Using natural riprap and trying to maintain a soft shoreline can be really critical, as well as minimizing outdoor lights. So these are just a few things, but they're all really great things. And then with the native plants, of course, that can help promote pollination, habitat, and other things as well. All right. So yeah, the last thing I want to say is I feel really grateful and privileged to have the job that I do. And one of the main drivers is that everything that we do, we hope that it has some kind of impact. And so collecting this data is important. It's not always easy, but if we can take that and use it to help make decisions that are based on sound scientific information, and then again, working with partners to collaborate and do things at scale, but also like being here today, this is one of the most important things, is to share knowledge and to engage with people that can make change, and that's every single one of us at our homes, at our properties. And then, of course, things aren't perfect, and so adaptive management is critical. And if we do something that isn't perfect, we study it, we change something, and we keep moving. But the key is to keep moving and to stay engaged and to take care of our natural resources and wildlife. And that's it. I don't even know. I think I went way too long, and I'm so sorry. But I will stop sharing my slides.
Annie, I don't think anyone out there will think you went too long. That was fantastic stuff. Really appreciate it. So much information. Well, and thank you again for being with us. Let's get to the questions. Handling this part of today's program is Jan Sandberg, Itasca Waters Board Member and Education Chair. Jan?
Hello, and welcome to the Q&A section for today's program. I'll tilt my camera. I don't know. I'm in the sun. Who knows? First, please submit your questions using the Q&A icon. We're not going to use chat today. I'm going to read the questions out loud, and Annie Bracey will answer them. And some of them might be kind of interesting here. We're going to have to probably combine some questions if they're very similar, and I suspect we're not going to get to all of your questions. So if you have further questions, please email us at info@itascawaters.org. So we're going to start the Q&A. First question. I love this question. It's from Karen L. in our audience. What is the most unusual or amusing behavior you've ever witnessed during your field research?
I love that question. It's pretty amazing. I would say one of the most unique experiences I've had was trapping black terns at the Agassiz National Wildlife Refuge. So if anyone's been there, of course, it's an amazing place to go and look at birds. But because of the nature of how black terns nest in the water, I was basically, we paddle boarded out with waders on, and then we're sitting in the middle of this wetland quietly. And just being able to hear, a bittern and realize it's like probably a few meters away from me. And then like as you're quiet, you can hear all of these birds come in. But in getting to do that, you can see these birds' behavior. And I think the most fun thing for me, whether it's black terns, common terns, these are more the species I study and have been able to get really close to, is watching them interact with their young, and that they are playful. And it's something you can imagine is true, but to be able to see that is really endearing to me. And so, yeah, just watching the adults interact with the juveniles, especially when the parents are out foraging, and the birds are young enough to swim away, they'll often hide in reeds and habitat. So when the parent comes back and no one's there, they start yelling at them. You can see them start to come back through the reeds. And yeah, it's just, again, a really unique and a privileged position to be in, to get to see that kind of behavior.
Thank you. We're going to do a 180 on the next question. And I remember you made a comment just a bit ago about your happy pictures. So Karen L. also wants to know, what's a predation event?
Great. That's a great question. So basically, a predation event is any time that an egg, an adult, or a young is killed by something else. So oftentimes with terns, which are co-nesting species, again, they nest colonially. So oftentimes they'll be with ring-billed gulls, especially in high numbers. And so when those nests are unattended, a ring-billed gull will come in and take an egg, or if there are young there, a herring gull might come in and take a young chick, or a great horned owl will come in and take an adult at night. So a predation event can be anything, but it's basically associated with some kind of mortality that occurs during the breeding season.
Okay, let's go to something happier. That's a little sad here. Okay, let's see. Sherry R. Wow, we have so many audience. Okay, come on, Sherry R. Besides noting the presence of birds, what other details would be helpful to report in your observation work?
Sure. So it really depends, on the species, on how much time people have to be out. But when we're counting birds, typically, again, if they're colonial birds, it's usually visual. So we try to just estimate the number. Sometimes, if you can't get to a nesting location, and oftentimes we don't want to minimize our presence and disturbance, but just the number of birds flying around. So the presence of any birds of any species is great, but that doesn't tell us if they're breeding or non-breeding. Then if you can count nests, that's a little bit more specific to estimate the number of breeding pairs. When we're monitoring songbirds, like we have over 30 years of a national forest monitoring program at NRI, we're mainly listening to them. So if they're singing, calling, drumming, so any kind of extra behavioral information you can get. If you actually see them with young, that's huge. That's probably the best information we can get, because then we know that indeed they were breeding and they successfully hatched young.
Thank you. So Catherine wants to know, why are the terns nesting in so few places?
That's a great question. And we don't have great answers. We are hoping that with all of the historical data that we have now, we have observations going back to the 20s and 30s, that we can kind of map out occupancy. So say there used to be, I'm making this number up, 100 nesting colonies in the state, and now we have 2. how long did it take to get to that point, and where did they start blinking out and when, so we can get some more nuanced information about that. One of the things I would say is that because their site fidelity is so high, if they continually go back to a place to nest and they're continually unsuccessful, so say there's just really bad predation or flooding events happen, that can really impact the population over time because these birds aren't just moving somewhere else to try a better spot. So oftentimes we call that an ecological trap, especially if you're trying to maintain habitat that's not actually suitable. So if we were trying to get these birds to nest at a location, but it was just surrounded by predators, we're basically setting them up for disaster. So there have to be a lot of right things in place, but from what we understand, what's happening in the Great Lakes beyond just Minnesota is that it seems to be a lack of suitable habitat. And because from all the banding data that we have and the migration information we have, they have like a 85 or 90% survival rate as adults. So we know they're not being impacted, or at least significantly, on their wintering grounds. So that's helpful, right? So then we can know that there's likely things locally that we can do to try to promote that. But it takes a lot of management, which again is a challenge.
Well, one of our listeners has a question. I think there's a little bit of overlap, so you can decide that.
Sure.
Wayne specifically wanted to know about the nesting success rate for the black terns. And then he asked about the main reasons for unsuccessful nesting, which I think you've kind of talked about a bit, but you decide.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So the black terns, I have to admit, are much more frustrating to study. They're beautiful, but the issue is that they do nest in much more loosely than these really strong colonial nesters like pelicans or common terns. You can get them nesting in pairs of, maybe 2 or 3 nests at one site and maybe 100 over here. And so they're harder to track over time unless you have enough money to get in and sample all of these locations. So in the example I showed where we went back to these historical nesting sites, some of the ways we picked the sites were on how long they had been occupied by both species and what their abundance was. So we tried to target places where there were more species, but as you can imagine with these black terns, which are wetland birds, so they nest in wetlands, unlike the commons that nest on shorelines, it's much more challenging to get to their sites. And so monitoring their trends over time is challenging. That's not to say that we don't have enough long-term data to understand that these trends are real, but we have a harder time documenting their movements in the state.
Okay. Next question is interesting because I'll warn you, it's not about terns. So
No problem.
Okay, and I love this because actually I have a cabin. We have so many hooded mergansers, and he wants to know what are the best things we can do to help the hooded merganser with their nest boxes. I don't know if you have ideas about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I to be fair, I don't study waterfowl or know about them as much as I do commons, but I do know that for other species that have used nest boxes like wood ducks and stuff, that some of the best things are just to make sure that the boxes are maintained and that there's not as many issues with predation, I guess, if you can reduce the likelihood of them being predated.
Okay.
That's not a great answer. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Everything helps. Lucy G asks, this is a longer question. Given how hard it is to attribute specific ecological changes, especially in birds, to climate change, do you think that taking strong climate action is still important for protecting these species?
I certainly do, yes. So that is a tricky question, right? And when people are already have the challenge of trying to identify stressors to different populations, adding on that layer of climate change when there are still some significant unknowns about how populations can respond. I would say with birds, again, just because they are one of the best studied taxa globally, we have long-term monitoring data from the USGS Breeding Bird Survey, from Christmas bird count, Audubon's Christmas bird count, from eBird data that we are not data poor in that sense for birds. And so being able to use that data to predict range shifts or to look at species sensitivity to fluctuating temperatures or all these different things that could potentially come with climate change, species will certainly be impacted negatively. And I think that regardless of the scale or the timeline, because some species will benefit, right? We'll see new species move in, but some species move out. And it's those species that are moving out that we see, like being on the edge of the boreal forest, right? Kind of the southern range for a lot of these. Now I'm outside of waterbird territory, but like songbirds, if they're moving north into Canada, that's great if there's habitat in Canada for them. But at some point, that northern edge is going to be limiting, right? So I think it's critical that we think about climate change and try to mitigate the amount of damage that is happening.
Okay, thank you. And I think Matt has a question that you partly answered before, but you might be able to summarize for him. I have a property on a lake east of Crookston, a little bit away from Grand Rapids area and Duluth. What can be done to improve habitat on that lake in that area?
Not being familiar exactly with the area or lake, I would say, in terms of water quality, and I don't know what the size of the lake is, all of those things can certainly dictate the kinds of things that you can do. But again, just I've never worked with the lake associations, but from people I've talked to, it can be a really amazing way to institute change or just to share information and educate people about what can be done in terms of, keeping shorelines natural so that they can move with these shifting, storm events and water level changes. Just having more of a natural shoreline is key, as well as, again, just trying to promote planting native species and things like that, keeping your lawn either natural or if you mow, trying not to use chemicals that can enter the water.
Great. And I might also suggest they might want to contact Minnesota Lakes and Rivers, which is a statewide organization that does a lot with shoreland protection and so forth. And my buzzer went off a while ago, so I think we are almost out of time unless you have a 45-second response to this complicated question. What trends or insights have only become visible through decades of waterbird data? Can you name one that you would think of?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So I would say I will answer that since I don't have a lot of time with not something specific, but again, just the importance of long-term monitoring is that, of course, you can imagine that we can't really identify changes. Okay, I'll try to give an example. Say you're studying a population of terns and you go out there one year and it's highly successful. Almost every bird hatched young. And then the next year you go out and it's a complete failure. Now, if you would have only gone out in one of those 2 years, you would have a really different idea of how the population is doing. And so as you add time on, all of those annual variability that's natural gets kind of washed out and a lot of that noise goes away and you can actually see signals of change, underlying change that you can't when it's short term, or a lot of populations are cyclical. You can't really find that out unless you spend a lot of time. So that would be my biggest message is the importance of long-term monitoring because it can be really hard to fund. People don't see the value in just going out and doing the same thing over time, but it's incredibly powerful. And it's one of the only ways that we really can answer these complex issues.
And
So,
I think that does it for today. Annie, thank you
awesome.
so much for your help and your involvement. And John, it's back to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Annie, and thanks, Jan. And that was a great program. This program is going to be available soon on our website at itascawaters.org. Please feel free to recommend it to family, friends, and neighbors. Also, we're asking for your ideas about the Water Wisdom series, and you can respond to the evaluation form. We'll email you. Now, did you love the mosquitoes we still had in August last year? The reason we had them is a lot of those were floodwater mosquitoes. The next program will be on May 7th, 2026, and featured Dr. John Oliver talking to us about those floodwater mosquitoes. So if you'd like to learn more about it, please register for free on itascawaters.org. While you're on the website, please consider becoming a member at itascawaters.org/donate or follow the QR code on the screen. I'm John Downing, and thanks so much for being with us today.